The night was humid and trembling with the weight of silence. Waves whispered along the docks of Yokosuka as a single warehouse pulsed with faint light from within, and inside that narrow building stood a small group of men and women who had been awake for 3 days straight, surrounded by stacks of metal tubes, glass jars, and thick notebooks filled with numbers that made no sense to anyone except them. Professor Kenjiro Sato adjusted his glasses with shaking hands, sweat sliding down his temple as he whispered to his assistant, "If this works, we may be remembered as the people who touched the sun." His voice was weak, yet every syllable carried the trembling certainty of someone standing on the edge of something that could change everything. On the far end of the room, a metal sphere the size of a barrel sat connected to wires that glowed faintly orange, humming with energy from a generator barely holding itself together. The experiment was simple in appearance yet terrifying in its intent. They weren't splitting atoms. They were trying to merge them. Fusion. A concept thought impossible, a word barely known beyond theoretical sketches hidden in university notebooks. The idea had begun 2 years earlier when Sato received a damaged physics book smuggled from a European library. Between its torn pages was a note, unsigned, suggesting that the secret to limitless power wasn't in breaking, but in binding, in uniting particles instead of destroying them. That note changed his life. For 2 years, his team of underfunded scientists and engineers worked in silence under the cover of night, pretending to be working on radar research while building something no one understood. Now, at 2:43 a.m., everything was ready. The world outside was quiet, unaware that beneath the flickering bulb of that warehouse, history was holding its breath. Sato turned the final switch. The generator screamed. Light filled the room in a sudden blinding flash that made everyone stumble backward. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Then came a vibration, not loud, but deep, like the heartbeat of the earth. The metal sphere glowed white, then blue, and then everything went still. The power shut off. Smoke curled around the wires. The lights flickered. No explosion. No meltdown. Just silence. Then one of the assistants gasped, pointing to the readings on the monitor, a small box of dials and needles that now trembled at impossible levels. The output energy was 6 times what they had input. 6 times. The impossible had happened. They had achieved a sustained fusion reaction for 0.8 seconds before the machine shut down. The silence was followed by laughter. Sato fell to his knees, not out of exhaustion but disbelief. His dream had come true. They had captured the sun in a bottle, even if only for less than a second. The news spread quickly through the closed channels of Japan's military research division. Within hours, the Imperial Science Bureau took control of the experiment, surrounding the building with guards and locking away every note, every wire, every name. The discovery was no longer science. It was power. A week later, Sato was escorted by officers to Tokyo, where he stood before high-ranking officials in a dim-lit conference hall. He explained the experiment with trembling precision, showing data and burned fragments of the reactor. The room remained silent for minutes after he finished. Then, one man, a senior officer with sharp eyes, leaned forward and asked quietly, "Can it be made into a weapon?" Sato hesitated, his throat dry. "Not yet," he said. "But one day, yes, if perfected, it could replace every engine, every bomb, every form of energy." That sentence sealed his fate. The next morning, orders were given. The fusion project was moved deep underground into a hidden facility near Mount Fuji, codenamed Project Dawn. Dozens of scientists were brought in. Some volunteered, others were forced. Sato became both a national hero and a prisoner. Meanwhile, whispers began to leak beyond Japan's borders. In London, American and German intelligence intercepted fragments of radio communication between Japanese research units and military offices mentioning a reaction brighter than fire and energy without fuel. At first, they dismissed it as exaggeration. But soon, photographs of energy readings from intercepted signals reached Washington, and the tone changed. In a meeting room buried beneath the Pentagon, American scientists stared at the data with disbelief. A young physicist named Robert Hayes spoke up, "If this is real, they've surpassed us all." His voice carried dread, not admiration. Because whoever held the power of the sun would hold the future. The Western world went silent. Then, they grew angry. American and German scientists had spent years studying atomic fission, struggling with equations, building test reactors that barely produced enough power to light a bulb. And now, a small group of Japanese researchers had done what no one thought possible. Pride turned to fear, and fear turned to strategy. Plans were made, secret operations began to form, and while the newspapers wrote about battles and politics, the real war shifted underground, a war of minds, secrets, and stolen discoveries. Back in Japan, Sato walked the narrow corridors of the underground lab, where air smelled of metal and oil. The walls trembled slightly from the mountain above. He could no longer see the sky. His invention had been taken from him, molded into something he no longer recognized. His assistant, Aya Tanaka, followed him silently, carrying a notebook filled with sketches. One evening, as the mountain winds howled outside the bunker vents, Aya whispered, "Do you think they'll use it for peace, Sensei?" Sato looked at her with tired eyes, his voice soft. "They never do." Far across the sea, in a smoke-filled office in Washington, men in suits argued around a long oak table. A telegram had arrived from their agents in Asia. It contained only one line, "The sun burns underground." The president leaned back, his expression grave. "Then we need to make sure it never rises." From that moment, the mission began, a mission that would send spies, saboteurs, and scientists into a silent race against time, not to win the war, but to stop the dawn from breaking. And in the depths of Mount Fuji, unaware of how many eyes were watching, Professor Sato began to see the cracks forming, not in his machine, but in the world around him. The discovery that could have united humanity had instead become the match that would test how much darkness men could create to protect their light. The rain fell endlessly over Tokyo that winter, a slow constant curtain that blurred the city's edges and filled the air with the taste of iron and coal. Inside the hidden compound beneath Mount Fuji, Professor Sato barely noticed the passing of days anymore. The light inside the facility never changed, always white, always cold. Machines hummed, guards marched in silence, and scientists whispered equations as if afraid the walls themselves were listening. The experiment had worked once, and that single moment of success had trapped them all in a cycle of obsession. Every night they tried again, adjusting the magnetic coils, refining the hydrogen isotopes, seeking that impossible spark that had once burned bright enough to turn theory into reality. The government demanded results, not progress, and Sato's name became both a legend and a threat among those who commanded him. Aya Tanaka, the youngest member of the team, watched her mentor fade slowly into exhaustion. His once neat hair had grown wild, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, and his hands trembled whenever he touched the machine that had once been his pride. She tried to remind him of the world outside, of the beaches he loved near Yokohama, but he would only smile faintly and return to his notes, whispering about energy, balance, and the way stars lived forever. Outside Japan, something darker was taking shape. In America, a team of scientists and agents met under a false research program. Their task was clear: infiltrate, observe, and if necessary, destroy the fusion project before it changed the balance of the world. The mission was given a quiet name, Operation Eclipse. It would never appear in records, never be spoken of publicly, and its agents would travel as traders, journalists, and even scholars. One of them, Daniel Rhodes, was a physicist turned intelligence officer. He had studied energy physics at Harvard and once dreamed of lighting cities with new forms of power, but now he carried a pistol and false documents. When he was briefed, he asked his superior only one question: what if they've truly done it? The answer he received was simple: then the world won't be ready for it. Not yet. Meanwhile, in Berlin, similar whispers spread through their scientific networks. They too wanted to know what Japan had created, and whether they could steal it before the Americans did. The war had made allies suspicious of allies, and behind every handshake was the thought of who would control the future once the guns stopped. Back in the mountain lab, a new reactor was nearly complete. It was larger, stronger, and far more unstable. The engineers called it Hikari, meaning light. It was said that if Hikari worked, it could produce energy for an entire city for days with just a cup of fuel. But the tests were risky, and the pressure from above grew worse. Sato could feel the invisible hands tightening around him, pushing him faster, harder, until there was no space left to breathe. One night, as the storm outside grew fierce and lightning flashed over the mountain, an unfamiliar man arrived at the compound. He introduced himself as Dr. Collins, a visiting scientist from a neutral nation sent to observe the project. He spoke fluent Japanese, too fluent, and his curiosity was polite but precise. Aya didn't trust him, but Sato welcomed any fresh mind that could challenge his thinking. For weeks, Dr. Collins moved quietly through the lab, asking about the magnetic chambers, the fuel injectors, the field stabilizers. He took notes, smiled often, and seemed harmless, yet something about his calm demeanor unsettled everyone. Aya once caught him near the communication room after midnight, claiming he was lost. Later that same week, one of their power readings disappeared from the records, erased completely. Sato confronted him gently, and Collins replied with a kind of sorrowful honesty, saying, "You've created something that can free the world, Professor, but the world isn't kind to those who show it freedom too soon." Sato didn't understand what he meant until the following month, when the first accident happened. During a test run, a coil overheated and burst, sending a wave of light through the chamber that knocked several workers unconscious. The energy reading spiked far beyond safety limits before suddenly collapsing. The damage was small, but the message was clear: someone had tampered with the systems. Aya suspected Collins immediately, but by the time the guards searched his quarters, he was gone. His notebooks were empty, his uniform folded neatly on the bed, and outside, the snow bore footprints that vanished halfway down the mountain road. He had disappeared like smoke. The investigation was swift and silent. No one outside the project ever heard of him again, and officially, there had been no accident. But Sato felt the air inside the compound change. The trust was gone. Every whisper now sounded like a secret, every face a mask. Then came the letter. It arrived through diplomatic channels, marked with foreign stamps and sealed with an emblem no one recognized. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing just one line in English, translated for Sato by a military interpreter. "If you continue to touch the sun, we will ensure it burns you first." The military dismissed it as a threat from rival agents, but Sato knew better. Someone out there understood what they were building, and they were afraid. He began to dream of fire, of endless white light swallowing the sky, and of his machine sitting at the center of it all, humming softly as the world turned to ash. Aya tried to comfort him, telling him their discovery could one day bring peace, light without destruction, but he couldn't believe it anymore. The project was no longer about discovery. It was about power, about proving dominance in a war where everyone feared being left behind. Months passed. The war outside grew worse. Resources dwindled, and the higher command demanded that Hikari be tested again, this time at full capacity. Sato protested, saying it was too unstable, that it could collapse the entire mountain, but his words fell on deaf ears. Orders were orders, and the date was set. The night before the test, Aya found him sitting alone by the reactor, staring at the glowing coils. The lights flickered over his face as he whispered to himself, "We wanted to create light, but all we've done is teach men how to hide it." She asked him what he meant, but he didn't answer. Instead, he handed her a sealed envelope and said, "If something happens tomorrow, take this and leave. There's a station 2 miles east of here. Go home, Aya." She refused, but he didn't insist. They sat in silence as the machines around them breathed and pulsed, as if alive, as if listening. When dawn came, the mountain was quiet. Snow covered the bunkers, and a cold wind carried the scent of rain and metal. Inside, every worker took their position. The countdown began. 10 seconds. The lights dimmed. 5 seconds. The hum deepened, shaking the walls. 3 seconds. The control rods glowed. 1 second. Then a flash. The mountain erupted with light so bright it turned night into day for a moment. The shockwave rolled through the tunnels, and every machine screamed as the readings went beyond anything the instruments could record. Then, silence again. When the smoke cleared, the reactor chamber was intact, untouched, yet everyone inside stared at the readings in disbelief. The power output had stabilized. The impossible had happened again, a sustained fusion reaction lasting nearly 5 seconds before automatic shutdown. Cheers filled the room. The experiment had succeeded beyond their dreams. But Sato didn't celebrate. He looked at the monitor and noticed a faint anomaly, a signal frequency that wasn't part of the system. Someone was transmitting data from inside the facility. Someone was watching, recording, sending everything to the outside world. And as the alarms began to blare, as guards rushed through the corridors and Aya called his name, Sato realized that their creation no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the world now, and the world was coming to claim it. Smoke lingered in the tunnels beneath Mount Fuji for days after the second test, and the air itself seemed heavier, filled with a strange metallic stillness that settled into the walls and never left. The guards patrolled in silence, scientists spoke in whispers, and the once hopeful hum of machines had turned into something darker, a sound that felt less like progress and more like warning. Professor Sato barely slept. He had seen the numbers, the readings, the anomaly that flashed across the monitor before the alarms began. It wasn't random interference. Someone, somewhere, had been inside their systems, copying every byte of data, every pulse, every equation. The discovery that had once been his dream was now scattered like seeds in the wind, carried to men who saw light not as salvation but as a weapon waiting to be aimed. Aya tried to speak to him, but he had grown quiet, almost empty, as if his soul had been drained through the wires of his own creation. She watched him stare at the glass chamber of the reactor, his reflection dim and frail, like a ghost trapped inside the machine. Far across the ocean, in secret rooms beneath Washington and Berlin, men studied intercepted transmissions and stared at numbers that made no sense. They realized Japan's scientists had achieved something beyond imagination, something neither their bombs nor reactors could match. For the first time, the war's victors feared that they might be too late. Meetings turned into arguments, arguments into panic, and panic into plans. The Americans wanted to steal the technology. The Germans wanted to destroy it. And somewhere between the lines of diplomacy and deception, the order was given for both to act before Japan could rise above them all. It began with small things, strange noises on the communication lines, missing supply trucks, shadows moving at night near the mountain roads. Then came the blackout. One night, every light in the compound flickered and went dark. The generators failed, the air system stuttered, and for a full minute, the entire base sank into pure, suffocating silence. When the backup power returned, half the monitoring equipment was dead, and one of the engineers was gone. No one ever found his body. Sato knew then that the walls were closing in. He had spent his life chasing truth, but now truth had become the very thing everyone wanted to bury. Aya begged him to escape, to take the research and flee before it was too late, but he only shook his head and said, "If I leave, they'll rebuild it without me. At least here, I can end it." A week later, the mountain shook again, but this time it wasn't from a test. Explosions echoed from the southern tunnels. The facility went into lockdown, alarms blaring through the cold halls as soldiers ran in confusion. Smoke filled the corridors, and in the chaos, Sato saw the familiar flash of foreign uniforms through the haze. It wasn't the enemy they expected. It was something worse, men who had come pretending to be allies, now turning their guns on both guard and scientist alike. Aya grabbed his hand and pulled him through the service tunnels, their footsteps echoing between stone walls. The air was thick with dust and gunfire, and somewhere behind them, the deep, rhythmic thud of machinery told him that the reactor was still running. Someone had restarted Hikari. Someone wanted to take it alive. When they reached the control chamber, the scene was madness. Sparks rained from broken panels, soldiers shouted, and in the center of it all stood a figure Sato recognized, Dr. Collins. His calm smile was gone, replaced by desperation as he worked the controls, downloading every last piece of data into a metal case connected to the system. Sato shouted, "Stop! You'll overload it," but Collins only turned, eyes cold, and replied, "You don't understand, Professor. The world cannot wait for your purity. Power belongs to those who can hold it." Before Sato could move, Aya rushed forward, trying to pull the cable from the reactor's control unit. Collins reached for his pistol, but the chamber's lights flared, blinding everyone as the reactor began to spiral out of control. The hum grew louder, deeper, until the walls themselves vibrated like a living heart. Sato knew it was over. The chain reaction had begun. He ran to the main console, ignoring the sparks burning his hands, and began typing a sequence he had written months ago, a shutdown command buried deep in the system, meant as his final safeguard. He could barely see through the smoke, but he felt every keystroke like a heartbeat, every number a prayer. Collins realized too late what he was doing. He lunged toward Sato, but Aya stood between them, holding a metal rod torn from the wall. Her voice broke as she screamed for him to stay back. Collins hesitated for a single second, and in that second, Sato pressed the final key. The lights turned white. The hum grew into a roar that filled the mountain, a sound so powerful it silenced every other noise. Then came the release, a wave of blinding energy that swept through the tunnels, erasing everything in light. From miles away, the mountain seemed to glow from within, a brief sunrise that lasted only moments before fading into smoke and silence. The explosion never came. The system had collapsed inward, consuming itself instead of erupting outward. Days later, rescue teams found only fragments of the facility. The main chamber was gone, replaced by a hollow crater lined with glassy stone. Of the hundreds who had worked there, only a handful survived. Aya was found near the outer tunnel, unconscious but alive, clutching a burned notebook against her chest. Inside it were the final pages of Sato's equations, and a letter. The letter was short, written in hurried strokes. The sun is not meant to be owned. It is meant to be shared. If one day humanity learns to hold light without fear, then let them remember that it began not with war, but with hope. The world above moved on. The war ended months later, not because of the mountain, but because exhaustion finally crushed the will to fight. The governments denied the existence of Project Dawn. They buried the reports, erased the names, and classified every trace of fusion research for decades. In the years that followed, scientists across the world began once again to study the same questions Sato had asked, tracing his forgotten footsteps in search of the power that could light cities without burning them. His name faded from history, but his vision lived quietly in the minds of those who dreamed of energy without greed. Aya never spoke publicly about what happened. She lived a quiet life by the coast, where the sea was calm and the sunsets were long. Sometimes at night, she would stand by the shore, watching the horizon glow faintly, and she would think of the man who once tried to capture the sun not to destroy, but to understand it. And somewhere deep beneath the mountain, under layers of ash and stone, a single chamber still lay buried, silent and forgotten, its walls faintly warm to the touch, pulsing every few years with a heartbeat no one could hear. The world above believed it was gone. But the light was still alive, waiting, patient, timeless. Because even after the darkest wars, the dawn always finds a way to rise.